Okay, so you know how much we love diving into these books that you send our way?
Yeah.
And this one, Same as Ever by Morgan Housel, this has been on my
I don't know,
list
me too.
for a while. I'm so glad we're finally getting to it.
Yeah, me too.
You know, you sent this in, you wanted to kind of get a grasp on those timeless lessons that are packed in here.
Right.
So, our mission today is really to distill those for you, to pull out those crucial insights about human behavior
Yeah.
and how they consistently, shape the world around us, and really importantly, how they shape our future.
Yeah, for sure.
We're going to focus on those aha moments.
Love those.
The stuff that really sticks with you without getting bogged down, I think, in those sort of endless details that can sometimes,
Right.
make these books a little hard to get through. And our main source, obviously, is Housel's book here.
Yep.
So what I think is so fascinating right off the bat is this core premise that Housel lays out.
Yeah.
We're constantly bombarded with news about what's changing, right? The latest trends, all the disruptions, the things that are new.
Right.
But he's really arguing that the real power comes from understanding what doesn't change.
Ooh, interesting.
And that's the fundamental ways that we as humans think and act.
I like that.
And he's suggesting that these enduring behaviors, they actually give us a surprisingly reliable way to think about what might happen next.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's not just sort of these broad strokes of, human nature.
Right.
He's saying these patterns play out consistently across the board.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, how old you are, how much money you make.
Right.
These patterns, he argues, are really universal and key to understand.
So think about that in a very practical sense. Like what's useful for you listening to this right now? Like think about Jeff Bezos's famous question.
Oh,
He said he rarely gets asked what won't change in the next 10 years.
right.
But that's really, to him, the most important question. So for Amazon, that answer is pretty obvious.
Yeah.
Low prices,
Yeah,
fast shipping.
makes sense.
People are always going to want that.
Right.
And so Housel's point is this principle focusing on the constants. This isn't just for business.
Right.
This is something you can apply to every aspect of your life and really
I love that.
goes it to understand your future.
And Housel's, very upfront about the things that he can't predict.
Right.
He can't tell you what the stock market's going to do next week.
Yeah, exactly.
He can't tell you who's going to win the next election.
Right.
But he's incredibly confident in the staying power of things like greed, fear, our tendency to form tribes.
Oh, yeah?
He also points to this recurring pattern of success leading to complacency in leaders.
Like clockwork.
It's a story, we see repeated over and over again throughout history.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll continue to see it.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
It makes you wonder if it's like baked into
Yeah.
human nature in a way.
I think so, at least to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, this really echoes, right, Voltaire's observation.
Yes. History never repeats. Man always does.
Timeless quote.
It's such a good reminder that even though the specific events, they shift
Right.
throughout history, the underlying human reactions, the motivations, the mistakes, they often feel so eerily familiar.
They do.
So I think let's dive into some of these same as ever patterns that Houssel really highlights
Yeah.
and see what we can uncover and what kind of insights they hold for us.
Okay, great.
So let's start with this interesting tension between our expectations and reality.
Okay. Yeah.
One of the real head scratchers that Houssel explores is why, despite all this incredible progress that we've made
In so many areas.
in wealth, technology, medicine,
Right.
things that have undoubtedly boosted our quality of life in many ways,
Absolutely.
why happiness levels haven't necessarily followed that same upward climb.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question.
It's something to really ponder, isn't it?
Yeah, and Montesquieu, I think it was almost 300 years ago, he had a really interesting take on this. Okay.
He said that we don't just want to be happy
Okay.
in isolation. We want to be happier than the people around us.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's this constant social comparison, right?
Right.
It creates a constantly shifting baseline
Okay.
for what we consider to be satisfying,
I like that.
this moving target of
Yeah.
satisfaction.
You're right. And this really hits home, I think, when you consider Housel's example of Rockefeller,
Oh, yeah.
right? Versus someone with, say, a lower income in America today.
Okay.
Rockefeller, he had unimaginable wealth for his time,
Right.
but he never had access to things that we totally take for granted.
Yeah, like what?
Things like penicillin,
Oh, right.
You know, decent sunscreen.
Yeah.
I mean, basic things that we now just expect.
Sure.
But as Housel points out, someone, who's maybe struggling financially today,
Right.
but does have access to these advancements,
Right.
they might not actually feel better off.
Because of this relative comparison?
Because they're comparing themselves to everyone around them.
Right, to their peers who also have these things.
Right, and often much, much more.
Yeah.
So what starts out as a luxury
Yeah.
very quickly becomes what we consider to be a necessity.
As everyone else's situation improves.
As the baseline shifts.
Right.
Yeah. Charlie Munger, he put it a little more bluntly.
Oh, I love Charlie Munger.
He said the world isn't just driven by greed,
Right.
it's driven by envy.
Ooh, interesting.
That constant looking at what other people have
Yeah.
plays a huge role in how we feel.
Right, whether we're content
Right.
or we constantly feel like we're coming up short.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting to consider the 1950s through this lens.
Oh, yeah.
This decade that gets this very nostalgic, rosy glow.
The good old days.
Right, the good old days.
Yeah.
But Housel points out that back then, fewer people owned their homes.
Oh, okay.
Houses were smaller, they were more crowded.
Right.
A much bigger portion of the average paycheck went to just putting food on the table. Workplace deaths were way higher.
Okay, so objectively worse in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but we have this very romantic feeling about it.
Right, interesting.
Which really shows how our expectations adjust, often forgetting the less rosy part
of the past, yeah.
Of the past,
Yeah.
yeah. Ben Ferentz's life story, I think, really exemplifies this.
Okay.
So he had a tough childhood. He was a refugee,
Okay.
escaping persecution, ended up in New York.
Okay.
But his parents, they were thrilled.
They were thrilled.
They were thrilled because their expectations
Oh, I see.
were shaped by the far harsher conditions
That they had fled.
Wow. And he went on to become a Nuremberg prosecutor.
Wow.
And by all accounts, a very happy person.
That's pretty remarkable.
So it really highlights, right, how much our expectations frame how we see our own circumstances.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah. Housel also shares this really poignant story
Okay.
about a friend of his who grew up in extreme poverty in Africa and still to this day feels just so incredibly grateful for something as basic as a warm meal.
Yeah, something most of us totally take for granted.
Completely take for granted. It really drives home this idea that contentment.
Yeah.
It's so subjective.
It's all relative.
It's all relative,
Right.
yeah. And then you have the stark contrast of Gary Kremen, founder of Match.com.
Okay, interesting.
So in 2007, he was worth something like $10 million.
Okay, not bad.
Which put him in the top 1% globally.
Wow.
But he was living in Silicon Valley.
Well, right.
Surrounded by...
Yeah, the hyper-wealthy.
Hyper-wealth.
Yeah.
He felt like nobody...
Even though he was in the top 1%.
Even though he was in the top 1% globally.
Wow.
And he was working these insane hours because he didn't feel rich relative to his peers.
Right, it's that social comparison again.
It's that social comparison again.
Yeah.
It's such a, I think, stark example of how enough is rarely an objective number,
Right.
but it's this constantly moving target, right, based on our surroundings.
Yeah.
And social media just throws fuel on this fire, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we're bombarded with these curated, often unrealistic snapshots
very curated.
of other people's lives.
The highlight reel.
It just amps up those comparisons.
Wow.
That why don't I have that feeling?
Totally.
And psychologist Jonathan Haidt, he makes this point that people are essentially performing on social media.
Oh, for sure.
It's not, it's not reality.
Right. So it's like we're comparing ourselves to a performance,
Right.
which just makes it even worse.
Even worse, yeah.
Yeah.
So while wanting what others have can be a motivator, right? To push us to do better.
Sure.
Houst argues that our constantly rising expectations can very quickly outpace the actual gains that we're making.
Like in your income or wealth.
Exactly. In our income or wealth.
Right.
That nostalgia for the 1950s, despite the objective downsides,
Right.
really shows how our expectations can run ahead of reality.
And make us miserable.
Yeah. So ultimately, he's saying managing expectations.
Oh, yeah.
Which is obviously not easy.
No.
Is a really crucial key
I think
to
so.
finding more happiness.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another one of these same as ever themes.
Okay.
This idea of the double-edged sword of our personalities. Particularly when we're talking about high achievers.
Okay.
So what's so interesting here is how the very traits that push people to achieve great things can also be the things that end up tripping them up.
Oh, I see.
So think about like those characteristics we associate with success.
Yeah.
You know, intense determination, relentless optimism, a refusal to take no for an answer.
Got it.
A really strong belief in themselves.
Sounds like a recipe for success.
Sounds like it, right.
Yeah.
But Housel flips the script.
Oh, okay.
And shows how those same characteristics, if they're taken too far, can lead to overextension. Coming on too much.
Got it.
And ignoring very obvious risks.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So this brings us to this concept of reversion to the mean.
Okay.
Which is something I think that's really important to understand.
Yeah. Explain that.
So basically, it means that things tend to drift back towards the average over time.
Okay.
Not just in our personal lives.
Okay.
We see it in economics, in the stock market,
All right.
even in, how well countries and businesses do over the long haul.
Right. They have their ups and downs.
Right. And those same personality traits that drive that initial spike of success can actually, over time, increase the likelihood of a fall.
Back towards the average.
Back towards the average.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah, it's a powerful concept, isn't it?
It is.
Empires are such a great example.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like a country with this intense desire to expand.
Yeah.
They're not likely to suddenly say, okay, we have enough.
No, they just keep going.
They just keep going.
And,
right.
And, Stefan Zweig put it this way. History does not disclose any cases of a conqueror surfeited with conquests.
It's a good one.
Yeah. And so that ambition that initially fuels growth.
Yeah.
It can just keep going.
And going.
Until it hits some major wall, potentially leading to decline.
Right.
Yeah. This also connects to something Naval Ravikant said,
Okay.
I think is so powerful.
What's that?
He pointed out that you can't just pick and choose the parts of someone else's life that you admire.
Oh, okay.
You have to be willing to take the whole package.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
He says 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 100%.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
It is, right.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about what you truly want.
Right.
When you look at these people that we often put on a pedestal.
Yeah, and want to emulate.
Right. Want to be like, oh, I want to have their success.
But are you willing to make those same sacrifices? Right.
To live their whole life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So consider the full picture. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so Housel also delves into this interesting area of how our brains grapple with probability.
Right.
Especially with these events that seem incredibly rare.
Okay.
And this is where, our gut feeling about numbers, it often lets us down.
It can be so misleading.
As Daniel Kahneman has pointed out.
Oh, yeah, great thinker.
Yeah. We as humans just aren't wired to intuitively grasp the scale of really huge or really tiny numbers.
Right. It's hard to wrap our heads around.
It is.
Yeah.
And that can lead us to completely misjudge how likely certain events actually are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Housel uses this fascinating example of Evelyn Marie Adams, who won the New Jersey lottery.
Oh.
Not once, but twice.
Wow.
In a relatively short period.
Wow, that's amazing.
So initially, the odds of this happening to any one person were calculated at this astronomical 1 in 17 trillion.
Wow. That's hard to even fathom.
It's mind-boggling. And of course, it made headlines everywhere.
Of course.
It's like, oh my gosh, this is insane.
Yeah.
But as these mathematicians, Percy Diaconis and Frederick Mosteller, pointed out, when you factor in the millions of people playing the lottery week after week, the probability of someone, somewhere, winning twice becomes much, much less improbable.
Right.
So they figured it to be more like 1 in 30.
Wow. That's still pretty crazy.
It's still crazy, right?
Much more likely.
But much more likely than
1 in 17 trillion.
Than 1 in 17 trillion.
Right, right.
And of course, that's not a very sensational headline.
It's not.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's a much more accurate reflection.
Of the reality.
Of the statistical reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So while these rare events grab our attention,
they do.
We have to remember that with a large enough sample size, the improbable becomes inevitable.
It does. It does.
So don't base your decisions
on these outlier events.
Yeah, exactly. That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, think about it. When you've got billions of people on the planet.
Right.
Even a 1 in a million chance event is likely to happen thousands of times every single day.
Yeah, and millions of times a year.
Millions of times a year.
Right, right.
And the media, of course, they're constantly looking for those shocking.
Right, they need those headlines. Yeah.
So it really skews our perception of how often these things actually occur.
That's a really important point, because the world can feel very chaotic.
Yeah.
And full of these improbable events.
Right.
But as you're saying, a lot of that comes down to just the sheer volume of things happening across this massive population that we have now.
Right.
And our natural tendency to focus on the extraordinary. And what's newsworthy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to something that definitely grabs our attention and tends to stick with us.
What's that?
The power of stories.
Oh, yeah. I love a good story.
I mean, this is so fundamental to how we communicate, how we influence each other.
It really is.
And Housel gives this really powerful example with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech.
Oh, yeah, iconic.
So the most iconic part of that speech, the section that we all remember that had such a huge impact, was actually completely unscripted.
Oh, well, I didn't know that.
It was the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson who called out, tell him about the dream, Martin.
Wow.
And he just went off script.
That's amazing.
And that spontaneous section just resonated so deeply.
It did.
And had this profound effect on history.
Wow, just highlighting the power of
storytelling.
Yeah, wow.
It's incredible.
It is.
Yeah.
So, good stories, they do a few things really well.
Yeah.
They inspire us.
Okay.
They evoke strong emotions.
Yeah.
And they draw attention to important issues.
Right, that might otherwise just be ignored.
Exactly. If they were presented as, dry facts and figures, they create a connection that raw data often just can't achieve.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about Mark Twain.
Oh, yeah.
His approach to writing.
Okay.
He used to read his work out loud to his family.
Not good.
And he would cut anything that didn't keep their attention.
Oh, wow. Ruthless.
Ruthless, right.
Yeah.
But he was so focused on what resonated with them emotionally.
Right, yeah.
And I think it really highlights how important it is to engage your audience.
Yeah, on that human level.
Yeah, and within those good stories, it's often the really powerful phrases that carry the most weight.
Little sound bites.
Right.
Yeah.
People might not remember entire books.
Right.
But they often remember specific phrases.
Yeah.
They become these mental shortcuts for that larger message.
Totally.
Yeah.
And Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker, he talks about good stories, creating these 1 + 1 = 3 moments.
I love that.
This synergy.
Yeah.
A deeper level of understanding that goes beyond the sum of the parts.
It's that added meaning.
It's that connection.
That makes them stick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the stories that are most persuasive, I think, are the ones that tap into what people already want to believe.
Oh, interesting.
Or extend their personal experiences.
Right.
Like Ralph Hodgson, he said, some things have to be believed to be seen.
Wow.
It speaks to that, right?
Yeah.
Even weak evidence can be very compelling.
Okay.
If it aligns with your desires.
With your desires.
Or beliefs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stories also act as these powerful filters, right?
They do.
For our attention.
Or focus our attention.
Steven Spielberg, he's a master storyteller, of course. Yeah. He said that careful manipulation and a good narrative can make diverse audiences react with the same emotions.
At the same time.
At the same time.
Powerful.
That's powerful, right?
Yeah. So Twain's success, Housel argues, came from his ability to really tap into those universal human emotions.
Right.
So his writing could connect with everyone.
Yeah.
From, a European Kaiser to a humble hotel doorman.
And his analogy, I love it. He said, great books are wine, but my books are water. But everybody drinks water.
I love that.
It's so good, right?
Yeah, it is.
So it makes you wonder how many great ideas or products might have just limited reach.
Right.
Because they weren't communicated effectively.
That's a really good point.
Dee Hock, the founder of Visa, he said, new ways of seeing things create far more innovation than new ways of doing things.
Ooh, that's good.
Right. So it's not just what you're saying, it's how you're saying it.
It's the packaging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yuval Noah Harari, as Housel points out, emphasizes that focusing on how you present things can unlock way more opportunities than just trying to be totally original all the time.
Right.
Yeah. So the delivery, the narrative, often as important, if not more important.
Than the core idea itself.
Than the idea.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about an area where we often lean very heavily on cold, hard numbers.
Okay.
And that's the limits of quantifiable data.
Okay.
Robert McNamara's approach, both at Ford and then at the Pentagon, serves as a really interesting cautionary tale here.
Okay.
He was a huge believer in data.
Yeah.
And statistics for making decisions.
Yeah.
Everything had to be measured, tracked, analyzed.
Right, right.
And that data-driven approach, it did have some successes at Ford.
Okay.
But Housel points out this really critical flaw.
Okay.
When McNamara tried to apply that same thinking to Vietnam.
Right. Very different situation.
Very different.
Yeah.
Edward Lansdale, who was involved in special operations over there, he pointed out this crucial missing piece.
Okay.
The feelings of the Vietnamese people, which is something that's impossible to capture in statistics, right?
Right.
So you have this disconnect between those statistics, like the kill ratios.
Right, which Westmoreland was obsessed with.
Right, obsessed with those numbers.
Yeah.
But Senator Fritz Hollings made this point.
Yeah.
That the American public, they didn't just care about these aggregate numbers.
Right.
They cared about individual lives.
Right.
Yeah.
And that alleged statement from Ho Chi Minh.
Okay.
You will kill 10 of us for every one of you we kill, but it is you who will tire first.
Wow.
It really encapsulates this unquantifiable but ultimately decisive factor.
Right.
The sheer will and psychological resilience of the other side.
Right. You can't measure that.
Not something you can easily put in a spreadsheet.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
So Housel really stresses this point.
Yeah.
That some of the most important aspects of the world,
especially when we're talking about, human personality, motivation, mentality, these are incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to measure.
Yeah, but we can't just ignore them, right?
No, because they can be the most decisive factors.
They can be the most decisive.
Absolutely.
So you have this famous quote from Lord Kelvin.
Oh, yeah.
That's etched at the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
When you cannot measure, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory. Which, it makes sense.
In some context.
In a scientific context.
Yeah.
But it can be dangerously misleading.
Okay.
If we start to think that anything that can't be measured is therefore unimportant.
Totally.
Yeah.
And Jeff Bezos offers this really good counterpoint.
Okay.
He said, what I've noticed is that when the anecdotes and the data disagree, the anecdotes are usually right. Meaning there's something wrong with the way you're measuring it.
Right. The Battle of the Bulge is a great example of this.
Oh, yeah. How so? So the American generals, they were relying on, their data, their maps, their logistics.
Yeah.
They didn't believe that Germany had the resources or even the strategic sense to launch this large-scale offensive.
Right.
But they overlooked this really crucial, unquantifiable element.
Oh, okay. What's that?
Desperation
Right.
within the German forces.